Today is August 12th, 2014. My name is Teresa Larson. I am talking with Margot Bannister Eness at what you might call the home place, or near their home place here in Ames. Margot, do I have your permission to record your voice and your picture today?
You have it.
Thank you. Please tell me your birth date and where you were born.
I was born in Ottumwa, Iowa, November 23rd, 1938.
What was your dad's profession in Ottumwa?
My dad, Dwight Bannister, worked at the Ottumwa Courier as a reporter. And so we grew up as a newspaper family.
From Ottumwa, I believe you moved to Decorah?
We moved to Decorah when I was 5, when my father bought the Decorah Journal. And he was the publisher of the Decorah Journal for 7 years then.
Why did you leave Decorah?
We left Decorah for when my dad took a position at Iowa State in the journalism department. And he later worked in the extension journalism at Iowa State.
About what year was that you moved to Ames?
We moved here in the fall of 1951.
So you are in your early teens. If I do my quick math, you might have been 11 or 12, something like that.
That's right. I think I turned 12 the first year we were here.
Okay. So your dad came to Iowa State University, but you did not live in town.
No, and that was unusual at this juncture. We lived way out in the country. We lived 3 miles from Ames and 3 miles from Gilbert. And my parents had always grown up in the city. Their parents had grown up in town or city. But when we lived in Decorah, my sister and I got horses. And we were crazy about the horses. And all we could think of is having a place where we could keep our horses and ride whenever we wanted to. And we engineered buying acreage near Ames.
Can you give me the description for the people who are watching and listening, based on current landmarks, where your father purchased this 80-acre acreage?
He purchased an 80 acres that at that time was a gravel road, which now is Grant Avenue. So the western border lies along Grant Avenue, and it was 80 acres, straight block down the middle to the middle of the mile. So it is overlooks what is now Ada Hayden Heritage Park.
And you said Grant, G-R-A-N-T Avenue.
That's right. It's a mile west of Grand, which is Highway 69.
Exactly. So. What were the southern and northern borders of that acreage?
The southern border was a quarter of a mile south of the house, and it bordered on another farm, another 80-acre farm, which was our fence line was the border line between the Gilbert and the Ames schools. And north of it was also a quarter acre past the house at the, I don't know what kind of landmark you call that, but it was down the hill from, at the bottom of the hill from
and
the house.
Didn't your parents' acreage at that time border Ada Hayden's family?
I think, if I understand where Ada Hayden's farm was, I think our southeast corner would have bordered or met with Ada Hayden's family farm.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your childhood, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the land itself. When you moved here in 1951, you were a school kid. Where did you go to school?
We went to school, well, I went to school at Gilbert. My 2 older sisters were enrolled in Ames, and we had to pay tuition to go to Ames, but my father thought that Ames certainly would have the better curriculum. But my younger sister and I went to Gilbert because we were in that district.
Did you have lots of classmates nearby? I mean, you're way out in the country. Who did you pal around with?
Actually, no classmates nearby, but the neighborhoods were smaller then, so people living a mile or two away you considered as your next door neighbor. So we had the Jensen farm family that lived across the mile, and they had 8 children, and they matched up with us, and the Jensen farm is also bordered Ada Hayden. So,
where were you able to ride those wonderful horses?
we rode. When we came to our farm, and you looked out to the west, the first trees you saw were across the river, the hills. That was woods. Otherwise, you have to take the trees out of the equation completely. So we looked down and you saw farm fields, because farm fields filled the bottomland. Very good land, except very wet, depended on the weather entirely. But the farm fields all met on the bottom. There were several: Ada Hayden's farm, Felber's farm, Jensen's farm. They all met down in the bottom. But across the far eastern section of our land was a 20-acre patch of grass. We thought it was grass. We thought it was wonderful tall grass. It was prairie that had never seen a plow. There was one track through it where the farmer had tried to plow it, but he wasn't able to. So that track remained for all the years we were there, but he had pulled his tractor out with horses. And
I'm going to just ask a quick question. What I'm hearing you say is there was a piece of undisturbed prairie that you played on that Ada Hayden probably walked on too.
that's what, after 50, it wasn't until 50 years later that I realized that we were that close in proximity. But when she was collecting her samples and her flowers and her drawings, she very likely was walking on what has become our land. And so it's very goose pimply for me to think of now.
Mm-hmm. So your horses you and your sister must have galloped your horses over that prairie.
Oh, we thought we were Laura Ingalls. You know, the prairie grass, when it was up, it was tall over our horses' heads. And when it was a fairly dry year, it was cut for hay, which makes wonderful hay for horses too. But we galloped all over the bottomland and never realized that we didn't have to worry about gopher holes or any animal dens or anything, because that bottomland stayed so wet most of the time that no animal was going to be foolish enough to build its den in that. There.
So in addition to riding your horses in the prairie land that was on the bottom, of course you had pasture up higher up on the hills. Did you ever ride your horses into town?
Well, it's funny you should mention that. I had a very good friend who always got me in trouble. And we get in that kind of trouble where we could always say, she did it. She'd made me do it. But we would have overnights. That hasn't changed probably. That isn't such an old-fashioned thing to do. And we decided, after we got there about 10 o'clock, we decided we'd go for a ride in the moonlight. That was okay with our folks. But then while we were riding in the moonlight, we rode down the hill to the bottom of the land. There was no lake there, you know. So there was a fence, a gate we could get through, one of those wire gates that you have to pull with your arm to get it to unhook, and pull with your arm to get it to hook back. We rode through, and we rode all the way to Highway 69, which at that time was still Highway 69, but it curved up past top of Hollow Inn and was a 2-lane road. We rode into town about 8 o'clock. And that was it must have been a weekend because the boys were dragging Maine. And I don't know if dragging Maine has gone out for Ames now or not, but it was the recreation for all the boys from the country schools, any schools, to drive around and around on Main Street to see what girls were. The girls were usually sitting in the cars parked on Main Street. But so we were riding down, and there was a little too much traffic for our horses. So we rode them up on the sidewalk right by the J.C. Penney's store. And at that point, the policeman came and politely told us we should get them off the sidewalk. It was too late then, but we got them off the sidewalk. And we said we were leaving. So we left Main Street, went down to Lincoln Way, rode out to the college. And at that time, there was a Dairy Queen sat on the corner that has been Taco Bell. It's sat on the corner of Highland and Lincoln Way, and we went through the drive-in, ordered ourselves milkshakes.
On your horses.
And it was awkward because then one of us had to hold the horse. We found out that we couldn't actually ride up there and get a milkshake from the horse. But we had our milkshakes, and then decided it was about time to ride back. This had taken us, it takes a good while to ride there. So then we rode home out on Stang. It was country road by the time we got out past the creek. So we were in the country then. And then my friend, who happened to be my future sister-in-law, but she was my friend, all of a sudden she said, "Oh, I think I'm car sick." Anyways, she had to. I said, "You can't. We're on the horses. You can't." And she said, so she had to get off her horse, and the milkshake maybe had been the topper on that one. And we came home, none the worse for wear. No repercussions. But yes, we did ride to town one time.
Except maybe a sore tummy. That might have been the...
Linda had a sore tummy.
Somebody had a sore tummy. I think that says a lot about what young people were able to do in the 1950s, that you could just take off and you could ride and your parents weren't worried about you.
No, of course they didn't know we were doing that, and they did think we shouldn't have done it, but not, no, they weren't worried about us. They just thought we might have gotten in trouble somewhere. So.
And speaking of the horses, you probably had some daily tasks, which would be different than the kids in town. You had probably some minor chores or responsibilities?
We took care of the horses, and then we did get sheep, and we joined 4-H and had our sheep, and so we had those chores, but we didn't work nearly as hard as our friends who actually lived on the farm and helped with farm work. We had, my dad had the ground was custom farmed, so we didn't do the actual farm work, but we helped bale hay and do those things.
So now let's talk just a little bit more about the land. If a person is driving north on Grant Avenue, it's mostly paved coming out from Bloomington now until it does hit gravel, and that's just about where your property started. So we're going to stand on Grant Avenue and look towards Ada Hayden Lake. So up at top we have the pasture land, isn't that right?
That's right.
That's right. And so then what happens as it goes down towards what is now the lake? Where did...
The house and the barn were on the upland, and the cropland started right at the bottom of the hill. The hill was never crop farmed. It was hay or pasture.
Wasn't it kind of wet to do row crops even in that area?
It was, it was very chancy, very rich ground, but very chancy. The first time we came to the farm, we learned, only I didn't realize that's what I learned, was that when the farmers back then always did the crops, they tilled the corn crop 3 times. And the 3rd time they had their corn laid by. Well, if they didn't, the reason for doing it that many times was to take out the weeds. If you didn't get it laid by, if you didn't get those 3 tillings in, you had outbreak of weeds, and in this case, it was cockleburs. So the very first time we came to our farm, we were standing on the hill and we looked down, and this was our land. We'd never had so much land before, and we wanted to see it all. So I and my little sister went running down along the edge of the cornfield, clear down to this tall grass, the prairie. And at that time it was very tall grass. And we decided we better come back. And we looked back, and the shortcut would be to come right through the cornfield. And there were rows, we could go through the cornfield. And I was wearing a it was a gold sweater that I was going to wear to school the next day to my new school. And we started through that cornfield, and we got into cockleburs, which I'd never encountered before. My little sister never encountered, and we had long braids, and we were full of cockleburs. And my gold sweater was completely filled with cockleburs. And I was so brave that I said, and the cockleburs smell. They have whether you have asthma or not, you feel like you have asthma. If cockleburs are very, very cloying smell. You can hardly breathe. And I very bravely said, "You wait here, I'll go get help." And I took off, and I got through that cornfield, and I came up looking like one big cocklebur. I'd left my little sister, who was just 8, down in the middle of the cornfield. And I was upset about my braids and my sweater. And my mother, for some reason, was upset about my little sister. And she sent my older sister, who was the good one, down there to rescue my little sister, which she did, and which I never even offered to do. But yes, the fields depended on the rain.
Now, I'm just thinking about cockleburs taking over, and probably what Ada Hayden might have talked about, that anytime you disturb that prairie soil, it's fertile ground for things to invade and get in there.
Very true, very good lesson that I learned a lot later than that. But that's...
You had the first experience, though, with them clinging to your sweater.
Yes. And there were times when it got flooded out. But then when it got dry, it suffered from drought as bad as the ones on the upland. There was no guarantee that just because that had been wet, it was going to stay wet through the really dry years either.
Speaking of dry years, I think 1955, 56 was a drought here in central Iowa. And I think that was the first inroad of Hallett Quarry in the properties just east of you. Do I have that sequence pretty close to right?
Yeah, that's right. Those have been years that actually the farmer who farmed our land said, this is an awful thing to do to a farmer. He had to plow up his land because it was zero crop, and to get the compensation and all, he had to plow up the land. And he owned the land just east too. And at that time, Hallett's Quarry made the offer, and he and the neighbor to the north, and I'm not sure which that was, they decided to sell. So the quarry started in 1957. They started with putting the big crane together. That took X number of months, and it was a fascinating show to watch.
And you were just right up on the hillside, looking down on this new operation. Can you tell me what you and your parents thought of this? I mean, this used to be farmland. Did you have an emotional response to this all getting dug up?
Well, it wasn't our land yet.
That's true, yeah.
And so it was, and we were disappointed but we weren't disappointed in a heritage way. We were just disappointed. But at the time, when it went through, Mr. Hallett, who was in contact with the farmers who was buying the land, that his plan was for this to be a gravel pit for as long as it could be a gravel pit, and then it would be a wonderful recreation area for the city of Ames. And that cheered us all up. So
mostly your sense of sadness was the fact that a farmer could not make it, that it was the drought had taken its toll on one of your neighbors.
Yeah, and he was getting, it was just the next step. We didn't think of it as the end of a era. We thought it was the next step.
Exactly. Before we go any farther about the land, I had forgotten to ask you if you rode your horses daily.
Oh, I think in the summertime, the good weather, yeah, I think daily for sure.
And I would think you kind of signaled to me that you were an adventuresome young woman anyway. So where else did you ride besides on your land and that one occasional foray into town? Did you go all the way east, like to the Skunk River? Did you ride in the river? Where else did you go?
Oh, we rode in the river and rode across the river, rode as far as what would now be the interstate, but Prairie Grove Church. Mm-hmm. We rode north toward, that's how we visited the friends that weren't close by. That's how we visited them. And right in that area, that was a short time in which horses were not the means. Most people didn't have riding horses. They had just gotten rid of their farm horses. They had tractors. So we were a little bit of rarities among the kids.
You were a novelty in some ways.
But we were able to ride our horse, and we gave our, as I noted, we gave our friends rides on our horses.
Mm-hmm. Well, that would be a kind of a friendship draw. Yes, the Bannister sisters. Yeah. You can ride horses at their place.
Yeah, people with serious farming, a horse was a drain because they didn't do anything anymore. So they were kind of a luxury, and we enjoyed our luxury.
Well, to come back to the land then for just a second. So in mid-1950s, Mr. Hallett is working the quarry, and you are watching from up the hill as this happens, and you are now in your older teens. You're probably almost ready to leave home.
Yeah, I was off to college.
Right.
For sure.
And so at some point, your parents also sold some land to
they Hallett's kept prospecting, finding there's more and more gravels, and so they sold 20 acres, which was the prairie, and then they gave them an option on 30 more. So they ended up selling 50 acres to Hallett's, and those first 20 are the ones that are, when you look down there, that's the prairie. That's where the prairie was. It's in the lake now. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of the 50 acres, they never really mind. The gravel did run out, but they wanted the land for an assurance of things.
So underneath the fertile prairie was some rock that somebody needed, and that's basically why that remnant disappeared.
That's right, because they weren't going to get a tractor through it.
Now they must have had some drainage ditches because it was kind of
I think those must have gone in the early 1900s, because this would have been a plain, the bottom line would have been running with creeks kind of crisscrossing it, trying to get to the river. And in the early 1900s, they straightened those creeks, and so that our land was bordered by 2 drainage ditches that were quite effective, and they drained it all the way to the river. Mm-hmm. And then there were, those were the most serious ones, but I believe there was one coming down from the south and the east too. South and the north too.
When you were riding your horses, did you jump those ditches?
Well, you could either, they were never that full of water, and they were, you could go through them.
Okay, you could go through them. I was picturing something 4 or 5 feet, and you'd have to make your horse jump over it.
No, you could. Our horses had to think about that. They weren't up for that.
Yeah. So you're basically describing for me, if someone is coming from the north on the interstate, and they get to kind of where the Oaks Golf Course used to be, that there was this huge bowl. that people would kind of go down into. You would go down into this bowl
So this was
of land.
just about a square mile ringed with the hills, but the hills on the north, south, and west were bare, grass hills, and the one across the river was wooded. But then the 69 cut through the eastern edge of that bowl and went up to Ames.
Speaking of travelers going through this big bowl of land that's now all developed and it has the lake, there was, I think, the J.J. Kuhn, one of the original settlers down there. They kind of piloted people through that area.
He lived what is now just across the river, and I believe his house is still standing. It's a 4-square gray house, right just as you cross the river and look to your left. And it may be deserted and on the chopping block now, but it was still standing the last time I went by there. And the road before 69 evidently led past his house. And people would stop and say they would be on their way to Zenersville to get coal, or on their way to Nevada to do the taxing, and they would stop there and ask him which route they should take through the slough that day, and he would help them out, or he would tell them.
Because of this bottomland area, it would change periodically where it'd be wet and where it would be dry.
Very, very much so, and it was all covered with grass, so you needed a pilot.
And just for the record, slough, I believe, is spelled S-L-O-U-G-H, and that's how I would pronounce it too. That's different ways of pronouncing it, but
Yeah.
I think that's...
Sometimes you hear the British readers on the book on tape talking about the slough, but no, we call it slough.
We call it slough here in the Midwest, yeah. And just amazing to think that I don't know when Kuntz, it's probably late 1800s when he was helping people get through the grasslands down
Yes, and then it was he had a daughter named Florence, who was an adopted daughter. And Florence married Leonard Felber, who was the farmer who farmed our land. So she was, I think Florence was his granddaughter, but there was still that connection up
You had
until.
a very close connection to the heritage of that land early on. People using it very young. Well, of course,
Yes.
Native Americans might have used it, but I'm
Yeah.
European white settlers.
Yeah, it's in the little chain of events. When you look back, you think, we're that close.
What else would you like to tell me about living on this land or the history of this land, or just loving this land that I haven't asked you so far?
Well, loving it goes without saying. Even when, after I was married and my husband was out, he was a veterinarian in practice, but he also came back to Iowa State College, and we built the house where we're sitting here right now. Where this house sits was where the barn sat on our farm. And so we built this house, and when we had little children, but I still had a yen for horses, and so we bought a horse. So then when I was 40 years old, we got a horse. And that was the first horse I'd ever bought a 2-year-old. And I actually trained that horse myself. I was so very, very proud of him. And I rode, and we named him Traveler because he was a gray horse. He looked like General Lee's horse to me. And so the gravel pit was now in full operation, but the rest of the area was still mine to ride. So I rode many miles around, and I could ride down at the gravel pit at night and come in from this side when the watchmen weren't watching, and they had these mountains to ride on, and so it was a whole new world, but it was well used. Yeah.
That's probably a piece of history that the gravel people might not know about.
No, they might not. Don't let them get into the archives.
But you were still exploring this land, Margot. You were still...
Yes, but I still didn't, it wasn't until that it was named Ada Hayden that I knew that I really started feeling the history of it, because then I started researching that and realizing how very close I was to history and how very close I was to ignoring that I'd been on this place.
You had remarked about the tall grasses. So obviously this is big blue stem. I mean, it's a tall grass prairie. Were there flowers that could be sustained?
Yes, and if I were Ada Hayden, I could tell you every one of them. I remember the compass plant, because that's still pretty striking. And I remember seeing, well, I thought they were just irises, but now I realize they were swamp irises, because they're down there in the...
Did you ever pick them and give your mother a bouquet?
No, because we were on our horse, we had to keep going.
Well, you could observe them, but at least you remember those. Those are very treasured memories.
And never took a photo of them, I think. But that was, cameras were a rarity then too, or snapshots. You just didn't do that.
Well, film was pretty expensive. It's not like someone using a digital camera now and they can take 100 pictures in a minute.
Yeah,
and not have that expense. You wrote a lovely piece about your land and your attachment to it that you narrated. What prompted you to write that? What was behind that?
Well, that was actually, I took a writing class I was at some graduate students had gotten a grant to teach a writing class, and it was called Environmental Writing. And when I wrote this piece, then it happened to be that Irv Kloss and Janet had arranged this reading for Ada Hayden Prairie, people to read pieces, and I read that one at that time.
Well, it's very lovely, and with your permission, I'd like to include that with this interview, because there are some impressions that almost work better in the written word sometimes than speaking.
Well, you'd be very welcome to do that.
And so again, my final question, is there anything else you'd like to share about your history with this land, or your sense of loving it and continuing to have an attachment to it?
Just that now the attachment is such that we still own 10 acres here. And we're looking seriously into if there are any programs for preserving that so that it cannot be developed. And preserving it as there's might be a chance of a grassland preserve, which we haven't made much progress on, but that's what we're going to try and pursue, because this area is slated for annexation. And Ada Hayden Heritage Park will be under even more pressure than it is now, because there will be houses all around it, close by. And we're hoping to preserve this 10 acres just there.
Thank you so much for sharing your observations and your stories with me today, Margot. It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome. It was fun to do.